In this particular video, my goal is to introduce you to some of the larger concepts that are framing Joseph Campbell's description of the hero. His journey is not simply an outline or a grammar, so to speak, for us to analyze narrative structures, although that's exactly how we'll be using it. But more than that, it also lies behind Campbell's notion of what it means to be human. It lies behind his whole description of the role of mythology in the larger sense, which includes all systems of belief, including science, religion, and what we would normally call mythology, and then on into literature, fairy tales, and so on. But for Campbell, the hero's journey is a description of that crucial path that not all of us choose to take. Remember, the hero can decide not to go on the journey, or later on not to return from the journey, and those have lots of implications behind them. But the story of the hero's journey here is the story of initiation. And for Campbell, as well as many other people who look at all of these belief systems as participating in one much larger universal human story, the question of initiation is at the base of all of these. And by initiation, what Campbell and others mean is that each of us has a choice in this life. In many ways, when we get to the matrix, we'll be seeing this. The choice of the red pill or the blue pill is the question of whether we wish to move on to the larger truths that are actually structuring the way we view the world, or to stay in the comfortable illusions of the everyday. Now, one of the primary points I'm making in our course on popular culture is that generally that particular distinction between the blue pill and the red pill, so to speak, is what's used to distinguish between so-called high culture in art, literature, in thinking, and so on, and so-called popular culture. But one of my primary theses in this class is that if we actually take a step back and take a look at the overall structuration of questions about reality, about people's roles in reality, not only do we get those kind of oversimplified narratives that sort of reinforce our everyday understanding of the world, which very much is one way to look at not only popular culture, but even so-called high culture, depending on your approach to it. But the question about popular culture also implies, in my mind, these much larger questions. So all narratives are participating in this kind of mythic structuration of our understanding of ourselves in relation to that which is outside of ourselves or within ourselves, assuming that we have universes inside us as well as outside us. So the overall theme that I'm using for this, as you can see in the title on this page here, is the illusion of separation. And that is basically our everyday life. That is what is not participating in the myth, so to speak. The myth is the way to reunite us with something that is much greater than ourselves. So let's take a look as I lay out some of these key points I see in the way Campbell wants us to imagine the hero's journey taking place. So, as in all of our work, we're using two different copies here. I'm assuming you're using one of these two. You certainly could have another. But on the left here, you can see this is the PDF copy that's available in several different places online. If you happen to discover it there, this gives you an electronic version of the text, and when I just have a single page reference, it's to this page, this particular version. Over here is the hard copy that I asked you to get. With all of our works, it's best to have both a digital copy for copying and pasting, and or even word searches. There are really important functions for digital copies. But in this case, it's also important to be able to go through with the physical book, at least in my mind, and do underlining, markup, and so on in the books. But this particular one is I will be referring to as NWL, or New World Library, and then followed by another page reference. So if I say 18/NWL 23, for instance, 18 is the reference to this book and the second to this book. So back to the larger context for the hero's journey. One of the first things that you see as we start reading it is that the prologue overall is referred to as the monomyth. This is the universal story that is told over and over again throughout all times and all places. Now, certainly in the human context we have this. We could even imagine this going on in other contexts. You know, if we could speak to the trees, to the animals, and so on, how are they structuring their understanding of things? You know, how are beings from other universes doing such? But the question of the monomyth is the way that Campbell is framing the entire discussion of his hero's journey here. Again, there are many, many so-called myths, many religions, so many spiritual ways of understanding our relationship to the world, including science, again, and other various academic pursuits, philosophy, and so on. But for Campbell, as well as many other figures such as Carl Jung, we are all participating at heart or at depth with one larger, what Jung would refer to as the archetypal myth. So that is the starting point and ending point for Campbell. Now, first of all, that's just kind of a statement for context. We all participate in one larger myth, and Campbell begins and ends with that. But that also is the larger point that I want to make in this overall conversation here, is that we belong to something much larger than ourselves in all ways that we can imagine. So again, the illusion of separation is exactly that. It's an illusion. And once we can pierce the veil of that illusion, we can see the underlying structures that tie everything together. So the hero is the universal human. And you'll see in the story that Campbell is telling us, the overall monomyth that he's laying out for us, the grammar, so to speak, of our psychic adventures, is that the hero is all people in all places at all times. And while we genuinely in English distinguish between hero and heroine, that's actually a sexist legacy where certain kinds of roles are normatively considered as a male role, the hero. And if you want to imagine a female doing that, a woman, someone identified as a woman, then you have the term heroine, and so on. In Campbell's language here, and much of it is older. When he uses man, there are a lot of questions about that. He's using it in the larger universal sense. I'm here saying human very deliberately. But for hero, Campbell is referring to both men and women and so on. So the larger story he's looking at is, what do we as heroes find along the path? And one of those things is that our everyday life, our experience in waking from sleep, just the distinction between sleep and waking, being born and dying, being young, getting old, being single, being in a relationship, being sick, being healthy, being wise, being naive, and so on. All these various oppositions are the ways we kind of get through life and understand life. And unfortunately, this is one of Campbell's main points that I find especially valuable, and today is the celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, is that these various dualities have often very drastic consequences. So we might, be led through these kinds of illusions of separation to, for instance, build walls that would separate us, insulate us from some kind of threatening outside, which we saw in China, which we saw with the Berlin Wall, which you see with the wall separating the Palestinians from Israelis in the occupied zone, and the wall along the U.S. southern border as well. What is missing from those kind of walled-in perspectives is this unity in opposition. And so all of these negatives and positives, as in the ancient Asian notion of yin-yang, are part of a larger unity. The yin cannot exist without the yang, and so on. And when you see the image, I should have put an image here for it, but I'm sure you all know what it is. The circle with the white swirl and the black swirl, the white dot in the middle of the black swirl, the black dot in the middle of the white one. You're getting this question of unity in opposition illustrated there. So here's a passage, and this is basically how I will be organizing this. I'll be taking you through various passages and explicating them, trying to unravel what it is that Campbell has in mind. So here I'm seeing this passage as Campbell talking again about the hero representing the universal human being. The hero, therefore, is the man or woman, and that's Campbell's language there. He says that right up front. The man or woman who has been able to battle his personal and local historical limitations to the generally valid, normally human forms. Such a one's visions, ideas, inspirations come pristine from the primary springs of human life and thought. So right there, we're already getting this sense that we have these personal, local, historical limitations. These are, perhaps the blue pill version of reality that we like to keep safely walled off from the threatening things that might shake up those realities. But behind that, beneath that, above it, englobing that are the primary springs of human life and thought, and we'll talk a lot more about what that might mean. Hence, they're eloquent, not of the present disintegrating society and psyche, but of the unquenched source through which society is reborn. And here, getting back to the notion of the hero's initiation journey, the ultimate goal is this kind of rebirth, to be born into a newer, higher realm of consciousness and of existence, of freedom from those previous limitations that held us bound to the illusion of separation. The hero has died as a modern man, but as eternal man, perfected, unspecific, universal man, he has been reborn. And the he there is every one of us. We have been reborn. His second solemn task and deed, therefore, as Toynbee declares, and as all the mythologies of mankind indicate, is to return then to us transfigured and teach the lesson he has learned of life renewed. Again, this is the larger initiation journey. The hero is initiated from a state of naivete or just lack of knowledge, lack of wisdom, into an experience of confrontation with the larger sources of reality, and comes back not only as an individual transfigured, but with the wisdom, with the tools, with the power, with the healing energies that our culture needs to transfigure itself, to be renewed. So, what do we as heroes find along the path? Furthermore, we have not even to risk the adventure alone, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The Labyrinth is thoroughly known. We only have to follow the thread of the hero path. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we shall find a god. Where we had thought to slay another, we shall slay ourselves. Where we had thought to travel outward, we shall come to the center of our own existence. Where we had thought to be alone, we shall be with all the world. Notice these oppositions here. Abomination versus gods. Slay another, slay ourselves, travel outward, and come to the center, alone and with all the world. These separations are illusory. So, one of the things that Campbell does later in the book, and you'll see here I've got this kind of abbreviation for, this is 1, section 1, 2 is chapter 2 within section 1, and 5 is section 5 within chapter 2 of the first half of the book here. And that one is a larger section 2 is called Initiation, and the little subchapter within there is apotheosis. Apotheosis is a really important concept here because this is kind of the culmination of the initiation process. We are no longer strictly in a human realm. We are now godlike ourselves. We recognize the divinity within ourselves. Jesus said, heaven is within you, for instance. So here you have a chart that Campbell lays out later in the chapter and in a note, and he says, in this chapter, the following have been equated. And that equated is a really important word there. He isn't just saying, here are the various oppositions I've laid out, in confrontation with one another. They are equated. They are no longer in opposition once we can achieve some higher consciousness that gives animation to them as the separate selves that participate in the larger universal reality. The void versus the world, eternity versus time, and the eternity versus time is probably the overriding one that Campbell will be using in ways I'll explain as we go on here. But nirvana, samsara, truth, illusoriness, enlightenment, compassion, the god, the goddess, the enemy, the friend, death, birth, thunderbolt, bell, jewel, the lotus, subject and object, yab yum, yang and yin, and then in these unifying systems here, the Tao of ancient China, the Supreme Buddha, the Bodhisattva who comes back after enlightenment to help liberate all of conscious existence, the Jivan Mukta, and the Word made flesh, as we find in the Christian story as well. So Campbell's primary grounding point that I'm trying to point out here is that this illusion of separation is actually, in its depth, unity in opposition. And if you imagine two planets in a kind of gravitational relationship to one another, circling each other, infinitely. This is another kind of unity in opposition. It's the ultimate reality beyond duality is where we end up if we have successfully concluded the hero's journey. And the specific belief system, but when I say specific, this is actually an extremely vast belief system covering thousands of years and thousands of miles, is the ancient Vedic tradition of Advaita Vedanta. And I will have reason to talk a lot more about this, but the major point is, again, the unity of source and self, however we want to think of those. So in Campbell's view, all belief systems, if you can get to the root of them, actually grow out of this Advaita Vedanta position. Advaita, if you can actually imagine the A, if I can get my cursor here, if we had a split here, Dvaita is the root of the word, and A is the negative one, as in amoral, and so on. What this means is that it's non-dual. So this is beyond dualism, but it's recognizing that we have come through dualism, and you can't just throw that away. We have gotten where we are because of our progress through the illusions of duality, recognizing sameness and unity at the source of that. So source, the unity of source and self. Source could be God in a particular system. It could be the Big Bang. It might be whatever it is that is the ultimate ground of your belief system. And your higher self. When Campbell uses the word self, he does so in the kind of esoteric way of referring to our higher self, our higher angels, so to speak. Not our everyday limited self, but the one that gives us our own individual complete integrity and unity in relation to this larger cosmic source. Okay, back to eternity and time. I mentioned that before. Here's another statement that comes a little later in the beginning of the book. The hero, as the incarnation of God, is himself the navel or axis of the world, the umbilical point through which the energies of eternity break into time. Now, I'm writing an essay on this, and I've given you some of the notes for that, and that would be a very different kind of presentation, a textual one where I operate very differently in that kind of linguistic textual register. But let me just kind of go through this a little bit. The hero, which is what we're looking at, as the incarnation of God. Now, let me just say that if we take seriously the Advaita Vedanta notion, the unity in opposition notion, however you want to frame it, that all is at root one, then all heroes, all anti-heroes, all beings are, to a certain extent, the incarnation of God, the gods, whatever your animating principle is in your belief system. We all embody and incarnate that in the ultimate truth. The hero, as the incarnation of God, is himself the navel or axis of the world. This is an ancient notion. Almost all cultures, certainly all that I'm aware of, in their ancient stages at some point or another, have this notion of the navel of the world, the point either where humanity rose up from levels, underground, subterranean levels, or in some ways this is perceived as a place where we perforate the surface of everyday consciousness to some deeper level below. And it's that little pinhole in the screen, we could say, through which we can peek through, get some access to the world below, the ultimate reality below that. The navel is that point that pierces through our everyday existence to the higher animating levels. It's the umbilical point, just as the child in the womb is connected through the umbilical point to the mother, but that point has to be severed in the birth process when you go from the point of eternity into the dualities of time. the umbilical point through which the energies of eternity break into time. So time is our everyday existence, our illusory sense of separateness, even the notion of time itself, beginnings and endings, births and deaths, are part of that illusion, because beneath all of that is this eternity. And there are these kind of magical, even when tragic, these magical moments when the energies of eternity break into time. Our everyday illusory structures are shattered, and we are suddenly face to face with some much higher reality. Sometimes we cannot handle that. Sometimes it is our own transformation, and in either case, it is a gift. So, some of the oppositions beyond what Campbell had listed is still using in the book: eternity and time, as we've been saying, heaven and earth, father and mother, male and female, death and life, conscious, unconscious, reality and dream, yab yum. That's an ancient kind of tantric sexual notion which brings together opposites into a kind of procreative unity, and not strictly physical, but it does include that, but also spiritual and cosmic unity. Yang and yin, light and dark, absolute and manifest, bliss and suffering. I'll be quoting from Campbell's, well, actually, Campbell didn't make the movie, but he was very interested in the land of bliss, in the Buddhist tradition, Sukhavati. And so bliss is the source of all existence, and suffering is our experience in time. And when we can break through that veil, we recognize the bliss. The bliss is not simple everyday happiness, but something beyond the opposition between happiness and suffering, comfort and suffering. Nirvana, illusion, transcendent, experiential, self and ego. Notice that, see, we often conflate these two in our culture. Self, we say you're selfish or you're egocentric. In this way of thinking, self is our higher self. Ego is our more limited self of how we understand ourselves as we go through the world. But our ego cannot see until confronted with these kind of shattering experiences of illumination, what the true nature of the self is. Cosmogony and journey, the sources of the cosmos, the birth of the cosmos, and the journey. And this is the way the entire book is structured. You'll notice the first half of the book is actually the journey of the hero. The second half, which we'll be reading after spring break, is cosmogony. What are the sources, not only of us as individuals in our everyday experiences, but the universe itself? And that will take us into Neuromancer and the Matrix movies. We could do this with any of the works we're looking at, but that's those best lend themselves to this question. The ineffable, that which is beyond all that we can express, this kind of ecstatic experience, and the material world, and macrocosm and microcosm. Again, the book is divided in these terms. The first half is the microcosm, the individual hero's journey, and how that can help transform the macrocosm, the larger cosmic implications of each of us as a hero, successfully or unsuccessfully engaging in this heroic quest. So here's a passage from the movie Sukhavati, as I was saying, and I'll let Campbell read this to you.
It's natural to life that life should be dangerous, and now it's dangerous for the planet. Formerly it was dangerous for this society, that society, or another. Just think of the Spaniards arrived and wiped out all the people in the Caribbean Sea within 2 generations. There were no more natives there. Then they wipe out 2 civilizations. 500 men wipe out 2 civilizations. The world has been experiencing absolute disaster. We've been so protected that we don't realize that. And now the fear of something blowing up. You see what I mean? Indra's, Brahma's eyes opening and closing. And okay, I heard one man say, there's no necessity that the human race should survive. Chief Seattle, in another of his words, said, why should I lament the disappearance of my people? All things die. The white race will find this out too. So yield to what is coming. We're in a free fall into future. We don't know where we're going. Things are changing so fast. And always, when you're going through a long tunnel, anxiety comes along. And all you have to do to transform your hell into a paradise is to turn your fall into a voluntary act. I mean, it's a very interesting shift of perspective, and that's all it is. Joyful participation in the sorrows, and everything changes.